Right, good afternoon and welcome everybody to this Scottish AI in Schools Week session on who owns what, all around the copyright and ownership of the use of generative AI. We're delighted to be joined by Freddie from the Intellectual Property Office, who is going to be talking us through. And my conversation is going to be very, very small. It's going to be over to him. After Freddie's done his input, we're going to break into some rooms where we're going to discuss a couple of scenarios and maybe just get a couple of viewpoints on how things are going. Freddie, we are delighted that you have taken the time to join us this afternoon. We really appreciate you taking time out your busy schedule. I know you're knee deep in AI at the moment, and I shall put myself on mute and take my camera off and hand it over to you, sir.
Brilliant. Thank you, Martin. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint. Hopefully that should now be appearing on everyone's screens. If you can't see it for any reason, please shout in the chat or, let me know.
Yep, it's coming through.
Brilliant. I can share these slides after the session. So if you'd like a copy, let Martin know and he can get in touch with me. As Martin said, I'm Freddie. I'm a senior policy advisor at the Intellectual Property Office. I'm part of our AI missions and technology team. So we're a team that looks at the interaction between intellectual property, societal issues, for example, in this case, education, and big technological changes. So in this context, AI. I'm going to start with an introduction of what the IPO is, our purpose, what we do, just to give a bit of context for my perspective. Then I will take a brief look at what we mean by AI and generative AI and what it can do. And then we'll take a look at some of the questions and issues around AI in education, the use of AI to create new works, and some of the risks involved in AI. I'm then going to have a final kind of couple of slides posing questions around particular issues of AI in the education setting. So the issue of kind of teaching AI, should we be teaching pupils about it? And should we be thinking about that as part of our kind of package of questions around AI? So if you have any questions, please feel free to put up a hand or put them in the chat. If you've got anything meatier you'd like to discuss afterwards, drop them in an email, and we're always happy to have a chat with interested people. Come on, PowerPoint. To give a little background, I thought I'd mention the full range of IPO functions for anyone who's not familiar with us, which is probably most of you, because before I joined the IPO, I didn't know what we did. So we are an executive agency under Department of Science, Innovation and Technology. Our most obvious headline function is granting UK registered intellectual property rights, so that's patents, trademarks and designs. But alongside that, we are also responsible for government policy relating to intellectual property. We advise ministers, so Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology is our ultimate responsible minister. And this covers policy across all IP rights, including copyright and trade secrets. We have a branch that supports in delivering education to businesses, consumers, other government departments, people like yourselves, on the potential risks and benefits of intellectual property, and to help support awareness of responsibilities and opportunities represented by IP. For example, we have a team of regional business advisors who run an IP masterclass program. We also support IP enforcement. We aren't an enforcement agency directly, but we support the police team who are responsible for that. And finally, we're responsible for negotiating intellectual property issues in international matters, so free trade agreements. Moving our focus to AI, I'm going to look at what we actually mean by it. So in general, AI is any machine that can mimic human-like intelligence. This is most obviously demonstrated in tasks like problem solving or the ability to learn patterns without explicit programming. Generative AI, though, is a special subclass because it takes this into the generation of new content, new materials. So things like images, texts, lesson plans, exam courses, music. And it does this by learning patterns from existing works. Generative AI has really kicked off in the last few years, most obviously with things like ChatGPT and Microsoft's Copilot. It learns its patterns from existing content, and that content may be IP protected, which is where we get to our issue of ownership and who has the rights to grant permission to use that copyright protected work. I thought it would be useful to look at a bit of the detail of how training works, just because I know this isn't something that often comes up. So one of the core challenges in discussing AI is that the training of generative AI isn't literally copy and paste. So we start with training data, in this case, our pictures of flowers. And from that, the AI model develops a kind of conceptual image of what all the potential flowers could look like. It will have an idea of what a human means by petals or what we would mean by blue. A user then comes along after training and says, draw me a red flower. The AI goes away, rummages through its concept of what flowers look like, and spits out something that you hope looks like a red flower. Part of the challenge is that, one, the training data sets are colossal. So the most common image data set is called Lion 5B. It's 5B because it has 5 billion images in. So there's a huge issue with making sure all of that data is safe and there's nothing harmful in it. And then there's also this issue of checking permissions for that volume of data is obviously going to be colossally difficult. There's also a risk that if there is a theme that's too strongly represented in the training data, say something like Mickey Mouse, there'll be millions of pictures of Mickey Mouse. So if a user comes along and says, draw me a famous cartoon mouse, the odds are that the model is going to produce something that looks suspiciously like Mickey Mouse. And then you get the risk of copyright infringement on the output. I'll discuss this all in a bit more detail later on. But this is just to give a kind of basic overview of what we're talking about when we're talking about generative AI. With training of AI and the use of it in mind in education, there are two main areas that we think are of potential issue. On the input side of the journey, so the input of training data, as AI companies frame it, we have to consider who owns the rights to all of the works, particularly in an education setting, and the permissions and safeguarding issues around getting permission to use work. This is obviously particularly challenging with young people because you then have the issue of communicating well what you're actually asking permission for, and the question of parents being involved as well, which I'll discuss a bit more later on. On the output side, there is the use of AI to generate new works. And this has two major questions, which are who owns these new works that the AI has created and what risks exist in the creation of new works. Because there is a risk that AI produces content which isn't accurate or has other issues, particularly in education setting. You want to know what your outputs actually say. Finally, there's this public perception issue. Education is obviously a sensitive topic for a lot of people, and so we also have to consider, even if we could completely resolve the legal concerns, would the public be accepting of the use of AI? So the status quo under British copyright law is that anybody copying a piece of work which is protected by copyright needs permission from the owner of that work. There are some very specific exceptions to this requirement, and AI developers argue that training of AI is permitted under those exceptions, both in the UK and abroad, because no complete copies of the work are stored. AI only develops that conceptual image. It's not actually holding a copy of every picture of a flower it's seen, it's holding the concept. However, this is an open question. It's partly what the consultation I'm currently working on is about, is whether AI really does operate within one of these exceptions. But regardless of the legal question, it seems likely that parents, teachers, and schools, and potentially departments for education in the nations would want there to be permission granted for the use of pupils' work and schoolwork in the training of AI. There's a contention about the use of works in training AI in general, so some caution would be needed. We also need to be aware of how parents and pupils would potentially respond to hearing that their work was being used in this way, particularly if there was any question of AI companies or the government making money out of the use of pupils' work in this way. Having said that, we then come on to the complexity of ownership and permissions. In schools, this is particularly complicated. For pupil work, it's relatively simple. Pupils are the default owners of the copyright in all of the work they generate, for example, essays, artworks, or musical recordings. However, you would need to seek either parental or direct pupil consent to generate copies of this, and therefore potentially need direct consent for the use of it in AI training. For works created by teachers, it gets a bit more complicated. It's most likely that the employer, through their employment contract, would own the copyright in the works created by a teacher in the course of their work. So, in principle, the employer could grant permission without consulting teaching staff. So there is a question about how teachers could respond to that if their school, academy trust, or local authority decided to license all of their work for a particular use. There's then also added complexities if some staff are contractors, for example, cover teachers, or if you had an external lecturer brought in, or if teachers are using resources from external inputs, things like Twinkle or the TES education resources, where there might be copyright on the original version of the work, and then the teacher could have modified it, potentially creating a new work, but potentially not. And so there's a whole potential daisy chain of questions to be asked about who owns the copyright and therefore who could grant licensing. So there's a few questions I think might exist in this space. There's the issue of how to discuss the whole issue with parents and pupils, how to make sure they are sufficiently well informed to make well considered decisions on any of this. How would permission to use copyright works actually be requested? There's a practical admin issue if you're dealing with thousands or tens of thousands of pupils to just ask the question and get coherent answers back. And then there's also just a moral angle about how would schools, education officials, teachers feel about the use of AI, the use of schoolwork in training AI. So there is this moral angle alongside all of the intellectual property issues. Moving to the output side, the UK is unique in the world because we have a provision for protecting computer-generated works. This provision hasn't been tested in court in relation to AI, and it's not entirely clear if it would actually apply to the outputs of generative AI. Setting aside this copyright issue, there's a big question in education about how comfortable everyone would be with using AI to create new content. There's also an issue with terms and conditions. So lots of the AI tools, their terms and conditions will say that the end user, so you, owns the output of the work, but that you are also liable for any copyright infringement or other legal issues with that output. And so if you're using them in a commercial setting or in a schools are not necessarily commercial, but in a setting, professional setting, there is an issue of ensuring that all the correct copyright permissions exist in the generation of works. So there is, again, a permissions issue with making sure that the work is not going to cause copyright liability further down the chain. Going back to the issue of comfort and the moral angle, there are potentially big benefits to AI. For example, you could produce personalized versions of resources almost instantly in some settings. You could massively speed up marking of repetitive work. So I used to be a maths teacher, and I remember marking the first few questions of maths GCSEs. You could have saved thousands of hours if that could have been automated. There's also the potential to save on a time on administrative tasks, and open up whole new ways of looking at education data. So looking for trends in pupil absence or whatever data the schools have available, there's potentially a way to work and get benefit out of that data, which we currently access. However, there's the risk that these benefits would be outweighed by the new work. Yes, maths teachers are us. I entirely agree. There's the potential that these time savings could be outweighed by the new administrative tasks of seeking permissions and guaranteeing security of pupil information and all the other issues related to making these systems work. So there's a certain amount of balancing the good with the bad. The last couple of slides, or in fact, not last, this slide is not really about an IP issue or ownership. It's more a question for discussion. So if we all accept that AI is probably not disappearing, there comes this question of should we be looking to educate the next generation in how to use it safely and how to use it productively? And this comes into sessions like this, which is to ask, do educational authorities, do schools, do school leaders have the knowledge and skills necessary to teach pupils? And how would this interact with the existing curriculum? And how could this shape education in general in the longer term, given that the government is talking about rolling out AI across, for example, the civil service and every sector it can get to? Is there a question of whether pupils will need to be fully equipped to use it once they get into the workplace? So this isn't really an IP issue. This is just a thought from me. As someone who is asked to know about AI, I realize it didn't even exist when I was a school pupil. So should we be looking to equip children of today to use it in the future? So hopefully this has given you a taste of the complexity around AI and training AI, and its even more significant challenges in an education setting. So feel free to drop any questions you immediately have in the chat, or feel free to get in touch with me afterwards or through Martin or my colleague Lisa, who is also on this call. So thank you all.
That's great, Freddie. Thank you very much indeed. That was, yeah, it's. I think the word minefield comes to mind with the way in which we're kind of navigating this space. I suppose my sort of question from the takeaway from that, you mentioned something about schools not being commercial entities, but what about academies and independent schools that do require fees and things of that nature that are almost run like a, is there a distinction between sort of public schools and academies and private schools in that regard, or do you just tend to lump them all into the one pot?
So I will admit to not being an expert in the various ways schools are structured and funded anymore, because I'm aware Academy Trusts are a whole different
Hmm.
ball game. Copyright law will apply equally to all. There are complexities in licensing
Hmm.
because some organizations will license work differently for non-commercial uses in contrast to commercial uses.
Yeah.
So if an academy trust was planning to profit from something on a commercial basis, I don't know, creating a set of lesson plans that they intended to sell for profit, there would be a different set of licensing issues in relation to that versus looking to use it purely in an education setting within a single school for no commercial benefit.
Yeah.
So there, the copyright applies equally, but in terms of permissions and licensing, it gets more complex and it varies depending on the commercial setting. There's also then a question of governance, which again, I will not pretend to know any detail of how schools are governed and run, but if ministers, if governments decided on a particular approach for AI in education, I suspect independent schools and academy trusts may have different scope for how they approached it
Yeah.
versus those directly run by local authorities. And that comes with a complete caveat. I know nothing compared to the other people in this virtual room about how schools are run, but it's something that would need to be explored.
Yeah.
how any government position would actually then subsequently roll out both within devolved administrations, because education is a devolved matter, so it doesn't matter what Westminster say, or it does matter,
Yeah.
obviously, but there is potential for variation in how this is approached across all of the UK. It's not going to necessarily be a blanket approach. So it's, again, a further deepening, slightly tangled minefield,
Mhm.
I'm afraid, on that front.
So the conversation around ethics becomes the more prevalent one in terms of the immediate sort of aftermath, if you like, of using generative AI. The legal one is obviously one that you're looking at from that standpoint on what the advice is. But I think from what we can do right now in terms of the conversations we're having with staff, pupils, and parents, it becomes an ethical ethics almost becomes like the prevalent or the mode or the more pressing issue right at this second for schools, and then knowing that the caveat that the legal might change and is open is open to being updated as we go through. Would you say that's probably an approach to take?
Yes, I
Yeah.
think the ethical issue and the question of whether it would be beneficial in an education setting
Hmm.
is perhaps the bigger decision to be made in education. I think, not to belittle the level of administrative effort that would be required to make any of this happen, I think the administrative question will be akin to GDPR regulations or
Yeah.
data security that already exists. It will be a big administrative task, but it's something that schools generally do on a lot of comparable issues. There's all manner of personal information that is held by schools on
Hmm.
things like free school meals. There's already a wealth of experience in those issues. And while copyright and training AI are obviously a whole new set of laws to work with, it's an administrative task that follows on from the moral decision of should we be doing this at all? Or if we are doing it, how do we use it to the best benefit of pupils and teachers? I should caveat that with that's more of a personal view than a government policy position.
Yeah, no. I think that's the caveat that we all have is very much of our personal opinion of what the main sort of approach should be right at this second versus exactly what the proper advice is, and that's I think that's true with a lot of these things. Are there any other questions that anyone's got that's wanting to ask? I know that Joe, you've just put in some of our schools are talking about using AI to summarize journal, and my instinct is that they would need permission from the copyright holder, but I would appreciate so they're thinking about journal articles and the way in which they're being summarized. So what's your advice there, Freddie, in that regard?
Unfortunately, it's an open legal question. It is being tested in court. There are some organizations who are explicitly licensing their work. So there's some academic publishers who are licensing articles for summarization in this way. So they have a license that says you can input our articles into an AI tool and ask it questions about the article, ask it for a summary. Um, but this is one of the areas that is not explicitly clear in copyright law. Um, I think, with the caveat that I'm in no way a copyright lawyer, having permission to do something will put you in a good place if anyone ever challenged you. Um, I think this is a case where asking for permission rather than forgiveness is probably the better approach. But it is an open legal question. It's being tested in court currently,
Mhm.
because AI is a whole new paradigm for which we don't have clear answers at the moment, I'm afraid.
David has also put an observation in. If AI tools can draw on copyright material, it would be a bit like when we were sampling music within music production. Bands just sampled stuff at first, but now there's tools that identify when a track has been sampled from an existing recording, which has a copyright holder. So obviously tools. I think there's things like Rihanna, is it Umbrella, is GarageBand beat number 3. I think that has been taken from its existence. Yeah, so would you agree with that, Freddie, or would you think that's the route that we're going down? That it's almost like AI is like music sampling at this stage?
I'm, there are certainly
Yeah,
parallels.
yeah.
Yeah, there are certainly parallels, and this is one of the open questions. It's one of the things we asked about in the consultation, actually, and it's a big point of discussion: is how do you attribute material that's been used in training or material that gets summarized? Um, it would be wonderful if that tool already existed. It would answer a lot of our questions, or at least not questions. It would be a very useful tool to have. Um, yeah, so I think it's, yeah, if you know anyone who has a tool like that, please let us know. It would be lovely.
Where can people get in touch with you, Freddie, if they're wanting to discuss this?
Oh,
Because I would imagine that people will. You may get an influx of emails, or you might get a couple of queries. You might be opening yourself up to a can of worms here, but I think it's always good that these conversations are taking place. So if people are wanting to discuss this with you a little bit further, where can they get in touch?
I will drop my email in the chat, and then if I'm not the best person in the IPO, I can obviously put people in touch with people beyond me. But yeah, if you can drop me an email at the first port of call, that works for me.
Brilliant. I can see Joe is typing. I suspect most Gen AI chews things up so much that it's going to be hard to detect protected IP. Um, I think that's probably true with a lot of things, isn't it? Actually finding the protected IP is going to require someone with a bit of skill to. I mean, the fact that Google Gemini, Apple Intelligence, a lot of these tools have been using Google's scraping tool to find a lot of the material on there. We have that issue with Google Images just now, don't we? Where Google Images show copyright images that people then copy and use without necessarily always attributing. So AI is just another sort of level to that, isn't it?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it is. It's a challenge, and I think this is part of the discussion the major creative industries are having with
Hmm.
government and with AI developers is is that copyright infringement and whether it's legally enforceable against, the use of images to create more images. And I think there is also uh, probably particularly pertinent for schools. There's a safety question with systems that can create video and audio. You can imagine, the faked malicious video of a teacher
Hmm.
where, you could have a teacher doing an unfortunate salute to a class. Um, it would take 10 seconds on some of these tools. That teacher's career is potentially panned. The pupil will probably never have any issues. But, there's a whole legal issue there to approach as well. Um, and yeah, and then there's personal privacy if you have video of individuals, pupils, or
Hmm.
teachers, and you can create faked versions of people, which I think is a whole other angle to consider. Is this safety issue? Yeah, so it's difficult.
Well, Freddie, I think we're definitely going to try and get you guys back to talk about this as the updates go on, because this has definitely been informative from our point of view. Folks, stay on the call because we are going to do just a couple of scenarios based on what Freddie was sharing. Freddie, on and Lisa, on behalf of Education Scotland, can I just say thank you very much for taking the time this afternoon to come along and share your expertise and your insights into the variable can of worms that we have at the moment in terms of who owns what.
Brilliant. Thank you. It's lovely to talk.
You too. Thank you. Have a great afternoon. Thank you. Right, folks, it's now over to you. So we were going to put you into breakout rooms, but I think because we're a small enough bunch, we're just maybe going to have you fill in the comments into the Easy Retro board. So I'm just going to paste in a link there to Easy Retro. that should allow you to fill in your thoughts on these. And we're going to give you just about 10 minutes to maybe have a think. So I'm just going to share my screen, go into my PowerPoint, and we have a few scenarios here. So we're actually going to do scenario 1 and scenario 3. We were having a discussion, Brian and I were talking about this as we were going through. We were talking about it with Kirsty and with Ollie, and we were thinking about this idea of ownership and what actually happens and what would be the main discussion points. So personalized learning portfolios, and I've noticed I've still got my American English on there, so I apologise for the Z. Brian has told me multiple times to stop having the Z on there, but I always forget. So a secondary school pupil uses a Gen AI tool to create a highly personalised learning portfolio showcasing their understanding of social subjects at the end of S3. The portfolio includes AI-generated essays, images and interactive timelines. The pupil submits this as their final project, claiming full ownership. So thinking about what you know and what you've heard and what you've seen over the past sort of half an hour and what you've been detailing with the work that you've been doing, consider the 4 discussion points there. While legally, from what we were hearing from Freddie, the student may own the output, ethically, how much of that work is their own? Does the use of AI diminish the student's learning process and the development of their critical thinking skills? And how can educators assess the student's understanding when the AI has generated a portion of the content? And finally, what are the implications for academic integrity and fair assessment? So considering those 4 discussion points in this scenario, in column 1 in that easy retro board, fill in your thoughts, some of the things that you've seen. We'll give an opportunity to take the cameras and mics off at the end, just in case anyone's wanting to discuss a few other things. But at the moment, we'll use that easy retro board, and you can fill in some of your thoughts on this first scenario. You can let me know if that board's working and if I need to change anything.
Should be all right.
Are we okay there, Brian? Thanks. So there's the easy retro board. And what I'll do is I'll leave that slide up and I'll move this onto my other screen.
And again, if you read the other scenarios and you get through, or if you read the other scenarios and think, well, actually, I would like to talk about that, feel free to stick your thoughts underneath each of those things. You'll see in the columns that Martin's created, you've got the prompt, the scenario at the top of each column, and then the discussion points directly below that. And so just when you add a card, it's all anonymous. You can add your points underneath each of those things, and they are deliberately provocative. I mean, these things, I mean, it's just to kind of open up the conversation.
Yeah, we fired these into Google Gemini, and I think we spent about 30 minutes sort of going through the scenarios, didn't we, Brian? Kind of making them a wee bit more focused on what might actually happen within Scottish schools, and the conversations that more than likely are currently probably taking place in a lot of regards. We certainly know through some of the discussions that we've been having that plagiarism has been a major concern. So I think it's good to kind of have these thought-provoking scenarios. So
It's interesting because I mean, I don't know how much of generating new content people have done with large language models. But I've said to Martin and the rest of the team sometimes that I've tried to get ChatGPT and the like to help generate song lyrics for my musical career. But I find them really bad, to be honest. I just don't find them, they don't feel authentic. And then the more you try and do it, the more times you see the same words and phrases being used throughout the kind of generation of those song lyrics. If you do it like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times, you'll see there's like the same use of words. And I wonder if that's true. I suspect it probably is for AI generated content around about a topic area, discuss, the construction of Hadrian's Wall or whatever. I wonder if the same language and vernacular is being used in the responses to that.
tried to get Suno to write a hymn. Joe, did it come up with anything that was kind of appropriate, or did it stick to the particular religion, or did it bring in aspects of different religions? I'm quite curious about that. Did you have to be quite specific with the prompt and develop a hymn on Catholicism or Christianity, or? I think you and David should start a Scottish educators band, Brian. Just you can just call you can. I mean, you had the lads with There She Goes. You could have the local lads, the local authorities. Can you see what I did there? Ba-dum-bum. Yeah.
You need some AI in there somewhere. You can only do it using AI generated song lyrics. Have the word echoes and shadows and things like that be repeated constantly throughout it.
Yeah. Okay, so just a couple more minutes. I can see some comments are coming in there, which are grand. And I think what we'll probably do is scenario 3 is probably going to be, so if you put in your comments for scenario 1 and you're maybe considering the next one we're going to do as a group is going to be scenario 3, because that's obviously having a son that's going through National 5 English just now. I know about portfolios. They're quite prevalent in my mind at the moment. So I think a higher English portfolio assistant is a good conversation to have.
Do you want to skip the slide forward to the scenario, Martin?
Yeah. There we go. Scenario 3. So in this one, it's a pupil in higher English having a first draft of their essay that they have uploaded to ChatGPT, Google Gemini, any of these tools. They ask the AI to suggest improvements to the structure, arguments, grammar, and whether the essay meets the requirements of the task. So they've done some good prompt engineering. How can teachers determine the extent to which the pupil has genuinely engaged with the task? Does the AI, in this context, undermine the development of the pupil's writing skills? What are the implications for the originality and reliability of pupil work? How can schools, local authorities, teachers adapt their learning, teaching and assessment policies to address the use of generative AI? That's probably quite a provocative conversation right now. And is there a distinctive difference between using Gen AI for this context and getting feedback from a teacher? What he's asked the Gen AI tool to do is no different to going in and saying, Mr. Clark, I've written this essay. Can you have a look at it and tell me what you think?
Or indeed, if you're in a situation where you have a higher English tutor, perhaps your family are paying for a higher English tutor. You get on a Thursday evening between 5 and 6, somebody comes to your house and tutors you and gives you that feedback. Is that any different? And actually, does using AI in this case just become a great leveler to allow everyone access to a personal tutor?
That's an interesting point, Natalie, that you put in the chat there, because we've seen that before. Those of us who have moved local authorities sometimes, we've maybe, luckily I've been out of school for a few years now, so I can say this. When I moved from Aberdeenshire to Aberdeen City, I took a pen drive and put a lot of the work that I created and copied it over to a pen drive. I left it in but ethically, should I have done that? Legally, it belongs to the local authority, but ethically, if I didn't get caught, so yeah, I mean, that is it makes it even more complex, absolutely, because there's nothing to actually, I suppose, if it's been created using a generative AI tool such as Google Gemini that exists via Glow, and it's been used during work time to create content, then
On your work's computer through your work's
on your
internet
work's
connection.
computer using your work's internet, it belongs to the local authority. I would think, again, this is me not speaking, the same way that Freddie didn't speak to that from a legal point of view. But from my understanding, if you use Gen AI on your work laptop during work time, using your work, using your work hot water to make the cup of coffee that you were drinking as you were making the thing, then yeah, I suppose again it's that ethical, legal conversation that we're all going through just now. We do have a couple more scenarios that we were going to get through.
Yeah,
but
we
I
had
think
5 originally.
yeah,
didn't we?
I think what we might do is